Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Carrie Ann Williams, and this is Black Mental Health Matters. Welcome to the show. I'm a psychiatrist practicing here in Massachusetts, and this is a talk show that's about everything related to mental wellness in the Black community. So if you have a question or comment throughout the show today, just drop a question in the comment box. So today, guys, as you can see from the title, I was expecting to have a guest, Jeffrey Aviles, to talk about hypnosis in the Black community. But I haven't heard back from him today. So I actually am not sure whether we're going to be doing a topic on hypnosis, as the guest has not presented today for the show. So in the meanwhile, I am going to talk about a different topic. If our guest comes today, then I will shift. But otherwise, I will just talk with you today about depression in the Black community. And of course, throughout today's show, if you have any questions that you want me to address, if you have anything that you want me to talk about, you can please do so. And I'd be happy to answer any comments that you may have. As I said, if the guest comes in, we'll talk about hypnosis in the Black community. And if they don't come, then we'll have a kind of a shorter show today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about depression. So, of course, depression is something that's really, really common. It's something we kind of just throw around as a word. We use the word depression. We talk about feeling sad. But we know that depression, as we use it in the field of psychiatry and psychology, is not just about feeling sad. It's a little bit more than that. So when we talk about it as meaning major depressive disorder. And major depressive disorder is a combination of things. It's not just sadness. And so, if you hear me use the word depression as a psychiatrist, usually I'm talking about major depressive disorder, which is a collection of things. Then we know that the prevalence of depression in African Americans is twice compared to white Americans. And often after African Americans are diagnosed with depression, they have more persistent symptoms. And of course, due to the consequences of systemic racism, Black Americans overall have a lower access to mental health services, you guys have heard before. So even when we recognize that there's a problem and we're looking for services, we are not able to access those services. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it is about finances. Sometimes it's about access because of insurance. And then, other times it's access just because of where you are located. If we know that if depression is not adequately treated, that people may end up kind of using the emergency room when they're in a crisis. And so what I strive to do with this show, and what we hope to do with uplifting mental health in the Black community, is to have more prevention and less kind of crisis-based care. What we would recommend, if you notice that you have an issue, if you are feeling depressed or anxious, that you try to get connected with a therapist before things get to a crisis point. Therapists are out there, they can help you to kind of understand yourself better. And they can help you to spot problems before they become full-blown problems. And there are a lot of different kinds of therapists and professionals out there. A lot of times people ask me the difference between them. There are LMHCs, licensed mental health counselors. There are LICSWs, social workers. There's PhDs. There's PsyDs, and other types of psychologists and psychiatrists. So psychiatrists would be medical doctors. We can prescribe medication. We're all out there to help people with problems related to emotional wellness, their thoughts, their behaviors. And we all help sometimes from a different angle. We all have different specialties. And so folks may get specialized training in certain areas. And then there are folks that they call life coaches that are not mental health providers at all. And a life coach will help you just to kind of work on specific life goals, but they're not there to provide therapy or any kind of mental health treatment. And so if you do see a life coach, it is not for therapy at all. It's for different reasons. And one of the things that people kind of say is, well, if I go to a therapist, how can they really help me? How can a stranger help me with my problems? But a therapist is there because they have this specialized training where they can kind of pick things up even before you realize an issue, or even as you're talking and you may think that things that you've experienced are normal or that what you're saying is uneventful, but the therapist can pick up the things from what you're saying that would be helpful for you to know. They can also pick up patterns. So, for example, if you are in a therapy kind of situation and you see a therapist on a regular basis, after a while, they'll pick up themes and patterns to the way that you interact with people, to the way that you solve problems, to the way that you think, and they can reflect that back to you. And in that way, they can really help to boost your insight into what's going on. And it can help you to learn more about yourself. So sometimes we feel like we know so much about ourselves already, but a therapist is there to help us to learn so much more about ourselves. And so some of the ways that you can know that maybe you are struggling with depression or with stress that's kind of getting to you, you may find that your resiliency is starting to kind of be reduced. You may find that you are waking up and you just lack energy and you lack motivation, and that you find yourself wanting to take mental health days. Like you want to go into work, but you can't. And the reason you can't go into work is because you are just feeling out of it. You're feeling sad, you're feeling tired, you're feeling like you're not sleeping well. And sometimes you feel like you just can't face the day. That may be a sign that you're under a lot of stress or that you're experiencing some depression. If you feel like your energy is really low, that may be a sign of depression. If you feel like you just don't feel like eating anymore, that may be a sign of depression. And even if you do make it to work, if you're feeling depressed, you may find that your productivity level is on the low side. And that's a problem, because if you're making it to work, but you're kind of not really all there, your productivity is low, your boss may start to notice, your clients, depending on what you do for work, someone may notice that your work is just not the way that it should be. If you are depending on productivity to earn an income, that then can affect your income level. If you are someone who has a performance review, that could affect your performance review. So these are some of the reasons why it's important to recognize and address depression, to not ignore it. The other thing that can happen sometimes with sadness and with depression is loneliness and isolation. And I got a comment here from Facebook about someone who has been living alone since his father passed away. And, this is something that, grief is one of the things that can progress into depression. Because grief is, it's 100% justified. If somebody has passed away, of course, you're going to feel sad. Of course, you're going to grieve them. But after a period of time, sometimes that grief can evolve into depression. And one of the features of depression is social isolation. So for someone who may then find themselves in this position, who now is living alone, they may have to make special efforts to kind of get out, get about, and socialize, and to be around other people. So if there are other family members that are around that you can spend time with, or even if you're connecting with them virtually because of the coronavirus, or if you're able to connect with them by walking outside where there's less risk of getting the virus, try to be around other people. And then if it's not family members, if you have a job, you may be able to socialize there, or maybe on the weekend, you may be able to go to certain places where you might be around people. Maybe that's just sightseeing. Maybe that's just to, a museum or some place that has either free or low cost for entry. That way you're not alone all the time. The other thing that, of course, could be helpful if there's any feelings of loneliness and it's related to grief is, again, you could do a short-term therapy, because that could help you to address anything that maybe you may not realize that you're struggling with. So thank you for leaving that comment. And guys, I just wanted to emphasize that depression is not just something that happens to other people. A lot of times we, listen to people talk about depression and we think, oh, wow, that's something that happens to other people. But depression is something that can happen to you. It can happen to any of us. It happens in our community. And sometimes it explains the behavior of other people that we see. So we might say, oh, why is this person acting this way? And why won't they do such and such thing? And you may not realize that they may be struggling with something. And that's the reason why they are behaving that way. They may be struggling with depression and stress, sadness, low motivation, loneliness, and that could be affecting their behavior. One of the ways that depression can present is through irritability. And it's one of the things that sometimes kind of is like a little bit of like kind of smoke and mirrors, that the person comes across maybe as angry, grumpy, snappy, irritable, and we think that maybe they're just a mean person. And sometimes what seems like meanness is actually sadness. And that's one of the things that we have to realize. Something that we know very well in psychiatry is that a lot of times when someone comes across as mean, what may be really going on is that they're sad, and it comes across as that unhappiness comes across as irritability. So anytime, I come across someone who seems to be a mean or irritable person, I always kind of wonder about what they've gone through. What have they experienced in their life that's caused them to have that unhappiness? Because people who are happy don't behave that way. So let's talk a little bit about ways that you can know that you're depressed and things that you can do about it. I've spoken a lot about sleep on different shows that I've done. Sleep is a very sensitive measure. Whenever your sleep is off, it usually means that something is going wrong in your body. It's one of the first signs that something is going wrong in your body. Now, sleep alone can't tell you that you're depressed. It can, go. It's not the only thing that can tell you that you're depressed. But sometimes, if you're not able to sleep, that is a sign you're depressed. Sometimes, if you're sleeping too much, that is a sign that you're depressed. So it's something to kind of think about is, are you having changes in your sleeping patterns? Because that could be a sign of stress or it could be a sign of depression. The other thing is just energy. So sometimes you're sleeping normally, but your energy during the day just feels sapped. You just feel low. It's a kind of a chronic tiredness, even when you've gotten enough sleep. That could be a sign of depression. Depression has a heaviness that comes with it. And then the other part of it is just a lack of enjoyment in life. So if there are things that you usually like doing, maybe you usually like cooking, or maybe you usually like music, but you find that you're doing all these things that you usually would like, but you're just not getting the same feeling of enjoyment out of them, that is a really sensitive measure for depression as well. When people get depressed, they start feeling like they're going through the motions. And they often feel like giving up easily. They feel like nothing is going to work, or they kind of just do things because they have to, but they're not doing them because they enjoy them anymore. And so this is, one of the signs of depression. The other thing that depression can affect is your appetite. Now, some people will engage in emotional eating where they're eating a lot more than they need to, and some will engage in sometimes they won't feel like eating at all. They'll just lack an appetite. And so you may just notice that they've lost weight. And if you don't know that they're depressed and you see them losing weight, you may not realize that it's unintentional weight loss. So I've always learned that whenever I've seen somebody lose weight, to always ask them about it without assuming that it's intentional weight loss. Because sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes it's because of depression or stress and those sorts of things. But that stress eating, either you're not eating or you're eating too much. And often when we're eating too much, it's not the good stuff. It is the junk foods. It's the snacks and the cookies and extra servings of dessert and things like that. So these could be a sign that you're stressed or depressed. So if you've noticed in your own life that recently you are gravitating towards foods that are, more sugary or things like that, then, I would say really kind of re-examine, are you under stress? Have you been feeling depressed? What's been the reason for that shift in your food choices? So the other thing that I think about a lot is a lot of times I get folks who they have problems concentrating and they think it's ADHD, and it might actually be depression. So inattention, right? Inattention is not a diagnosis. So inattention doesn't mean you have ADHD. Inattention is actually a symptom. And a lot of diagnoses have features of people that have trouble with concentration. Depression is one of them. So when people are depressed, they often have a hard time with focusing. Sometimes it's because they kind of space out. And sometimes it's because they are just kind of like so lost in their thoughts that they are not able to retain information. So they'll kind of listen to something, but they're not really paying attention to it. They don't remember what they heard. They don't remember what you said. If it's a kid in school, they're not learning. If you're at work, you may be just less productive. So it may affect your attention, but it doesn't mean that you have ADHD. You don't need ADHD medication. It might be depression. In fact, when older folks, like in the geriatric population, have depression, it can actually look a little bit like dementia, and they call it pseudo dementia. Because it looks like they're kind of starting to lose their memory and this sort of thing, but it's actually depression. And when it's treated, it resolves. So the other thing you may find if you have depression is that you have a lot of negative and pessimistic thoughts. So maybe you find yourself leaning towards being negative, kind of blaming people, shaming people, being grumpy. And that's the unhappiness that I kind of spoke about a little bit earlier. Maybe you're the one that is irritable and grumpy with other people. If that's happening, you have to examine, like, is this who I really am? Is this who I want to be? What's going on that's causing me to feel so irritable and so unhappy? Why am I taking it out on other people? And that's where you examine, like, is it that something's happened to me? Is it something that's caused me to feel bitter about life? And that's something that would be helpful to talk to a professional about, is feeling bitter about life and feeling like you can't be cheerful. That's an issue that should be addressed, because there's a reason for that, and you have to explore that reason. Is it forgiveness? Is it something that you're holding on to that you just can't let go of? So for you, kind of examining that. For some people, it is that they may need to explore trying a medication for depression. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But sometimes it is that, you need to try something just a little bit more than what you've been doing. So the other thing that can fuel depression is something that we all know, and that is guilt. The feeling of guilt. Now, sometimes that feeling of guilt is not necessarily valid, like you don't need to feel guilty about the thing you're feeling guilty about, but having that feeling can be something that fuels depression. So it may be that you're feeling that you're the cause of something bad to somebody else. One thing that depression tells us that we're a burden to other people. It's not true, but depression tells us that we're a burden to other people. So I want you to kind of think about that for yourself and explore, have you been having thoughts like that, feeling like you're the cause of problems, or that, you're a burden to other people? Because depression often makes us have thoughts like that. And that, of course, can lead to feelings of hopelessness, feelings that people will be better off without you. And that's a kind of a dark place to be. So if you have that kind of inclination that somehow things would be better off without you, that's definitely a sign that you need to talk to somebody, because that is a perspective that is narrow, and it comes specifically just with depression. So if you have depression and you have it treated, you meet with a therapist, you meet with a psychiatrist, maybe even consider medication, those thoughts can improve. So things can get better. Depression is a way of narrowing our thoughts, but things can get better with time. So, why do I even bring this up? Because in the Black community, sometimes we think that, again, the things that I'm talking about happen to other people. It doesn't really happen to us. But I remember looking up the statistics. And prior to the pandemic, suicide was a third leading cause of death in Black males and the fourth leading cause of death in so the third leading cause of death in Black male children and the fourth leading cause of death in Black men. And when I say fourth leading cause of death in Black men, this is ahead of like cancer, ahead of diabetes. More Black men were dying by suicide than by cancer or diabetes. Okay. So I don't have the statistics that for during the pandemic year, but prior to the pandemic, we had more Black men under age 44 dying by suicide than by cancer or diabetes. So this is something that's really, really relevant to our community. For Black females prior to the pandemic, Black girls under 19, for Black girls under 19, suicide was the fourth leading cause of death. For Black women under 44, suicide was the fifth leading cause of death. So it shouldn't even be on here. I think there are a lot of things that we can do to help uplift the mental health of our community. And so that's part of the reason I have this show. That's part of the reason that I talk about these things. So what do we do to help address depression? So one of the things that we do is start to examine the way that we think. So one of the kinds of therapy that we do is called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. So in CBT, we look for all the thought distortions that feed into depression. And there are so many. One of them is called Magnifying the Negatives, which is where when life happens, your brain magnifies all the negative things about the situation and minimizes all the positive things about the situation. So if something good happens, like, oh, you got a promotion at work, your brain is going to filter out the promotion and kind of magnify all the negatives. For example, if you got a promotion but didn't get a raise, it's like your mind just minimizes a promotion and magnifies the fact that, oh, but I didn't get much of a raise and it's just going to be more work and that sort of thing. So magnifying the negatives is one of the mindsets that can feed into depression and make it more of an issue. There's a lot of times where people kind of refer to pessimism as realism. So they'll be really pessimistic, but they kind of think of it as, well, I'm just being realistic. And actually it's not, because if you filter out all the positive things and only focus on the negative, that isn't realism. That is pessimism. And it's a depressive mindset. It's something that keeps us stuck in depression. So the other mindset that can kind of lead you into depression is called fortune telling. And so this is when you predict the worst possible outcome. So they'll say things like, oh, well, I'm going to fail anyways. I'm never going to make it, or this is never going to happen for me. That is negative fortune telling. That's one of the ways that we can stay depressed, because if you're always just thinking only bad things are going to happen, that's going to kind of keep you in a depressed place. The other one is called jumping to conclusions, where you just kind of expect the worst. So that is going to keep you in a place of hopelessness. So one thing that I wanted to mention too is another one. It's called emotional reasoning, and we don't even realize it, but sometimes we kind of reason just based on our emotions, based on how we feel. So for example, if you are afraid to drive on the highway, then you reason that the highway is unsafe. So that's emotional reasoning. Your whole decision that the highway is unsafe is really based on your fear, because people are driving on the highways every day and you can drive safely on the highway. But if you have emotional reasoning, you may determine just based on your feelings whether something is safe or not. So you can't determine safety solely based on your feelings. That's emotional reasoning, right? So that's where the emotions are in the driver's wheel. The emotions are the ones that's driving your conclusions. And the key is to know what's happening, to be aware that that's how you're making decisions. So sometimes you need another person to call it out. That's what a therapist does for you. They can call that out. They can say, hey, I notice that you're making this decision based on your emotions and not on the facts. The therapist will help you to kind of reflect on things. One of the things that I sometimes hear people getting caught up in is using the word should. So they'll say things like, I should be doing this, or I should be doing that. And then what ends up happening when we use that word should is that we're constantly setting up a standard that then we're falling short of. And so then You start feeling defeated. It can kind of feed into depression. So one thing that you can think about is to try not to use the word should so much, because that is going to end up setting you up for a standard that, maybe you can't reach, or maybe you're going to keep falling short of. So kind of be careful of that word should, and ask yourself, this should statement that I'm making, is it going to make me feel better about myself, or is it going to make me feel disappointed in myself for what I'm not achieving? So we can kind of set ourselves up that way. And one of the other things I'll mention is I've noticed that folks that struggle with depression tend to come with this feeling of having no control over things in their life. Like this loss of like, well, I can't change this. I can't do anything about this. There's nothing I can do. And this kind of mindset of feeling like you have no control over anything, that can lead to giving up. That's a depressive mindset. So this feeling of having no control, that can lead to feelings of helplessness. And that's part of like the depressive kind of triad of helplessness, hopelessness. So what do you do when you have these thoughts, when you have these emotions, when you have this kind of going on for you? I mentioned therapy. I mentioned going to see a psychiatrist. Sometimes it is helpful to take a medication, so I'll talk about that right now. Not everybody's comfortable with the idea of taking a medication, but medications can be life-changing. It really can be life-changing. I think it's important just to get all the information that you need. Know that every single medication has side effects. So side effects doesn't necessarily mean that a medication is dangerous. It just means that it can cause a side effect, and you need to be aware of what can be done. So if a medication were truly dangerous, it would have been taken off the market, right? So if something has a side effect, the question is a side effect something that I can tolerate? Is it reversible? How bad is it? So if the side effect is headache, but the medication would otherwise take your depression away, would you be willing to deal with the headache if the medication actually treats your depression, for example? So I think it's really important to kind of examine what are the side effects, what's the chances of the side effects happening, and could you handle it? Is it reversible? That kind of thing. So don't write off medication just because a medication has a side effect. Most things in life have potential consequences. It's all about a risk-benefit ratio. So, the theory behind the use of the medication is that our emotions can be influenced by chemical factors in the brain, and the medication can influence those factors. So it's not 100% kind of like cure-all, but it does have some influence, and it can be helpful. You don't have to take medications forever unless they're helping you and you want to continue taking them. But in many cases, medications can be a short-term thing. It does become long-term if your depression recurs when you stop taking it. So sometimes people just need to take medications in the long run. You have to do what's needed for your situation. Sometimes depression is inherited. So you may not know this, but depression can run in families. You can have many generations of people that struggle with depression, that struggle with suicidality. And when it's biological like that, when it's hereditary, sometimes it is helpful to take a medication because it definitely there's something genetic going on, there's something biological going on. So it may be helpful then to get into therapy, maybe consider taking a medication there. The other thing to know is when we use psychiatric medications, it's not necessarily kind of like one and done. Sometimes the first medication you try doesn't work, and you need to try a second or a third medication. And sometimes you have to combine the medication treatment with a non-medication treatment. So you take the medication and you do therapy, or you take medication, do therapy, and you do some lifestyle changes like exercise or diet changes or that sort of thing. So it's important to really kind of think about all the options that you have. That's as much as I'm going to say today about depression. Today's kind of a shorter show. As I said, I had a guest lined up and the guest did not show for today's show. So I decided to talk about depression instead. If you guys have any questions about depression, or any questions for me, or any topics that you want me to talk about in the future, definitely leave a comment in the comment section and let me know what you want to hear about in the future. And I will hope to talk to you again soon. So I'll be back again next week, Sunday, with a guest. And I will talk to you guys next time. Have a great week.